So far, then, we've been discussing the 5 views that are associated with the afflicted intelligence. And these are the views that need to be abandoned in order to develop the ultimate view or realization. The first of these was the view of the perishing collection, and that is the mistaken conception that the self is the mind-body aggregates. So we impute this notion of a self upon the body and the mind, and by that, then we have a mistaken view. And it leads to suffering, and not only that, but it is an obstacle to our meditative practice, because as you know, then all meditation is about getting rid of clinging. And this is the very coarse form of clinging that clings to the material body as being self, and also to these mental events as being a self. And the other day, then I explained how the aggregates of feelings and discriminations should be included within the aggregate of formation. This is quite an important point, so I just would like to recap that now. Feelings are these raw sensations of pleasure, pain, and neutrality, and this does not involve any discrimination. The aggregate of discrimination or perception or distinctions is where we start to discriminate in terms of things being good or bad. For example, pain is bad, pleasure is good. And not only that, then discriminations involve the distinctions between different types of experience and object. For example, this is a man, this is a woman, that is a tall building, that is a small building. This is where we make distinctions between the different experiences and objects that arise to mind. And the level of formation is then when we develop this kind of karmic intention. So what happens is, based on our discriminations, then we make intention to create karmic acts. And these are the karmic acts of body, speech, and mind. And then the other day I gave the reasons why the Buddha had separated feelings and discriminations from formations, even though they are subsumed within this category. And that's because for lay people, when I say lay people, I mean people who aren't involved in the spiritual path, primarily get into fights over feelings. And then for monastics, who at least on the outside are supposed to have given up these petty concerns, then they get into arguments about different types of philosophies. They make distinctions between what is a good philosophy and what is a bad philosophy, what is a higher form of realization and a lower form of realization. And on the basis of this, then they get into arguments, they get angry, and they create negative karma. Today, then, we're going to talk about perverse view or mistaken view. And this isn't just about our view being good and others' view being bad. It's not that. It's got to do with this point about these cornerstone principles of any religious tradition. For example, we see killing to be a negative thing. Stealing and lying should be abandoned as well. Basically, all religions have these core beliefs, and these do not differ significantly from one tradition to another. These we can call valid views. These are unmistaken views. For example, it is wrong to kill. That's not mistaken. So exactly what is a perverse view? A perverse view is a view that takes that which is a non-virtue to be a virtue, and likewise that which is virtue to be non-virtue. For example, if we say giving is a bad thing, then that's a perverse view, that's a mistaken view. In general, we won't see giving to be a bad thing. We see it to be a good thing. There are conditions under which we come to the belief that giving is a negative thing. For example, if I give money to a beggar on the street, then often people will say, you shouldn't give him money, he'll just use that to buy drugs or alcohol. What we believe in the Buddha Dharma is that generosity is something that is naturally virtuous. And it is virtuous because it helps one get rid of one's clinging to material objects. When we give things away, we have to let go of them. So in reality, we often practice generosity for our own benefit and not for the benefit of others. Likewise, some people criticize this tradition within the Buddha Dharma of giving alms. For example, traditionally, the monks and nuns would go out into the villages and beg for food. Now, many Westerners think, why are these Buddhists so lazy? Why don't they just work instead of begging from others for their sustenance? And so this as well is what is called a mistaken view, because in the Buddha Dharma, we see it to be a form of virtue to support the Sangha. And there are many examples where we take virtue to be non-virtue. You may wish to protect the life of somebody on death row. However, others may feel that this person deserves to lose their life. And so they see your virtuous act, this wish to preserve a human life, to be a negative thing. And this as well is seen as being a mistaken or perverse view. Likewise, when it comes to honesty, then some people get upset when you tell them the truth. And that's very much the case on the spiritual path, because it is the responsibility of a spiritual teacher to be honest with their students and point out their faults. The purpose for pointing out their faults is so that they may improve themselves and gain some traction on the spiritual path. But others will get upset and saying that teaching the Dharma is just a form of criticism. For example, in the Dharma we say, it's not good to be desirous, it's not good to be angry. And some people see this as a negative thing. This is an act of virtue. It's an act of practicing honesty. And actually, this requires a lot of courage. It's very difficult to tell people what they don't want to hear. But in a way, if you're a spiritual teacher, it's your responsibility to do just that. And so taking this act of being honest for the benefit of another as something negative itself is what we call a perverse or mistaken view. Now, a perverse view or mistaken view also applies to those circumstances where somebody takes a non-virtue to be virtue. And in general, we find this difficult to understand because we all believe in these core sets of principles. For example, it's not good to kill. But it is the case that some spiritual traditions view killing as a form of virtue. For example, blood sacrifice. This is very common in the Hindu tradition. The Buddha taught that making blood sacrifices for the sake of God was an offering made out of ignorance, so it was a mistaken form of generosity, and said that it was ultimately a negative thing to do. Likewise, it seems that Jesus Christ tried to change this tradition in the Jewish religion. He went to the temple and symbolically released a dove that was to be sold for sacrifice. And there are many religions in the world that use blood sacrifice as a form of offering. They see it to be something virtuous. But what we believe in the Buddha Dharma is that taking a life is a negative thing, whether that be the life of an animal or a human being. And so, rather than being a virtue, this is something that creates negative karma. And here is the main point, because in the Buddha Dharma, when we talk about karma, it's very much about how this act will affect the way we perceive the world in future times. And of course, if we engage in a non-virtue, thinking it is a virtue, then this will become an obstacle in our spiritual path, because on the basis of our negative virtue, we are going to acquire a negative rebirth in future times, and this will be a hindrance in our spiritual path. It will stop us from meeting the true Dharma, and also will cause us to experience negativity in the lower realms. So, whereas I think we're all familiar with this tradition of blood sacrifice, and likewise, I think many of us will see this to be a negative thing, it's hard for us to understand how somebody could take stealing as being a positive thing or being virtue. Well, there is a sect in India called the Tugis. Although they were outlawed at the time of the British Empire, they believed that stealing from strangers was a virtuous thing. Not only did they steal from strangers, but they also took their lives. And they made this as an offering to Kali, or the Lord of Death. So we can see that this is a completely mistaken view. It's not something positive in any way. But this isn't something just reserved to strange religious cults. This is something we do in our daily lives. For example, many people try to avoid paying taxes. And we don't see this to be something negative. In some way, we think that it's wrong for the government to take money from us, and so we try to find ways to get out of it, legal and also illegal. But the Buddha taught that this is also a negativity. This is a non-virtue. If somebody has a responsibility to the government to pay taxes, then it's their duty to pay those taxes. For example, we all like this story of Robin Hood. We see him to be a virtuous thief, somebody who stole from the rich and gave to the poor. And many of us have this idea. In some ways, we think it's okay to steal from a big corporation, but it wouldn't be okay to steal from a poor person. But in terms of the Buddha Dharma, then stealing is a very negative act. This feeling that you have the right to take something from somebody else that belongs to them only causes non-virtue and is not a virtuous act. This is very much a gray area for us, but I would suggest to you that if you wish to practice on a spiritual path, then you should do your utmost never to steal or take that which is not given. And the reason for this is the consequences of stealing is that in future lives you will be impoverished. And so for a spiritual practitioner, this is very difficult. If somebody doesn't have the means to allow themselves to sit in meditation without worrying about the funds for their food and their lodgings, then that's going to be an obstacle for them progressing on the spiritual path. It is the case that those who have accumulated great stores of virtue don't have to worry about these things, and they seem to easily be able to incorporate their practice into their daily lives without worrying about money. It's often the case that we are jealous or we resent those people who are very rich. For example, if there's the richest person in the world, we think, why does he have all that money? How come he deserves that? But in the Buddha Dharma, it is taught that this wealth comes from past virtue. And what is that past virtue? That past virtue is the virtue of generosity. So if in future times you yourself wish to be wealthy, then you should apply yourself in this life to generosity. Likewise, I think it would be quite difficult for us to understand how lying could be a virtuous thing. But some people do see lying as being virtuous. For example, if you work in the secret services or undercover police, then it's pretty much part of your job to deceive and lie to people. Also, there are many people who are con men, and they see it to be positive to lie. For example, there are all these kinds of scams that happen on the internet these days, where they try to get people's money off of them. Now, many of these originate in other countries, in third world countries, where they have a grievance with the Western world. For example, they have this grievance against Western colonialism in Africa. And so when they engage in this activity of deceiving people, they're doing it as a kind of payback. And they don't see it to be negative. They see it to be a positive thing. This is what we call a negative or perverse view. And that's because we're taking something that is fundamentally negative to be a virtue. And then we engage in that, believing that it's something good to do. And on the basis of that, then we create negative karma. And based on this negative karma, then in future lives, we're going to experience difficulty. Lying to people means that in future lives, they won't trust you. They won't take you seriously. And based on this, then you find it very difficult to go through life. Sometimes we wonder why nobody ever has any respect for us. But you have to see that the cause of this happened in previous times when you engaged in deception. And so always be honest and transparent with others. And if you're open and honest and transparent with others, then in future times, your speech will have great weight, like Gandhi or Nelson Mandela. So I think we can all understand that killing and lying and stealing are negative things. And also, I think we believe that jealousy is a negative thing. But it's very difficult to identify jealousy. In general, we don't see it. We can sit with our friends and we can criticize somebody who's famous and rich and say how they don't deserve to have so many followers or to have so much money. This resentment we do not see to be negative. In fact, when we're talking and gossiping with our friends and criticizing somebody who is rich and famous, we see it to be a positive thing. Somehow that we're putting the world to rights. But this is a poison on our mind. Jealousy makes one unhappy. If we are an extremely jealous individual, then naturally we will not be content with whatever we have. And this lack of contentment is a huge obstacle on the spiritual path. The Buddha taught, be easily satisfied and of little desire. And jealousy is the opposite of this. Jealousy is somehow reinforcing this idea that we don't have that which we deserve. But what you have to understand is, in the Buddha Dharma, that what we get is based on our previous acts. It's based on karma. And so, a fundamental belief in karma is the single most important thing for anyone on the spiritual path. Likewise with pride. Now, in the East, this is not so much of a problem because they see pride to be a very negative thing. But in the West, in general, we see pride to be positive. For example, we say, I'm proud to be a Canadian and I'm proud of my child. Well, we don't identify this sense of pride with being something negative. Now, when it comes to the core or principal beliefs of the Buddha Dharma, then these last two are a little bit difficult for Westerners. One of these core principles is that engaging in sexual misconduct is a negative thing. Likewise, if you've taken a vow of celibacy, then you shouldn't engage in any sexual conduct whatsoever. So one form of sexual misconduct is to rape someone. In modern times, we are all aware that some people use rape as an offering to God. In fact, some people believe this is a form of gaining entrance into heaven. But this is a mistaken view. This is what we call a perverse view. And it's not only in extreme Islamic sects. There are also these cults in India that use prostitution as a form of religious practice. In terms of Indian law, then if something is part of a religious tradition, then it no longer becomes illegal. And so it is a way of contravening the laws on prostitution. These poor men and women who come from lower castes are being used in order to generate money in the name of religion. Now, it is true that in many traditions, for example, the Tao tradition, then sexual interaction is used as a form of religious practice. Now the question is this negative or is this positive? Well, it can be a virtue and it can be a non-virtue. The problem is that it requires a very high level of spiritual practice in order to use one's desire as a tool to gain leverage on the spiritual path. And in general, what happens is we just like this idea of engaging in sexual activity with a consort in order to develop spiritual practice. But for ourselves, being ordinary individuals with no spiritual attainment, then this only becomes a way of strengthening our desire. And as we know, it's this clinging and desire that causes us to suffer in the 6 realms of samsara. And it is by getting beyond our desires that we achieve some kind of realization or emancipation. So what it is taught is the sexual act itself is not fundamentally or naturally a negative thing to do. In fact, you can engage in intimate relationships with your partner based on deep affection and love. The problem is that we have desire. And it's this desire that takes away our mindfulness. Now, these sexual practices that are used on the spiritual path, are there in order to quell our desire, not to increase it. And so, for an ordinary individual, when they engage in these kind of sexual practices, it can be something that is only making their desire stronger and only increasing the causes of their future suffering. And likewise, it's similar when it comes to practicing with intoxicants. In the Buddha Dharma, it specifies alcohol, but really this refers to anything that has the ability to take away your mindfulness, because it's on the basis of us losing our mindfulness that we engage in further negativity. In the West, as far as I can tell, then we're very keen to use intoxicants as a means of gaining spiritual attainment. In fact, it seems that many people believe that the use of intoxicants, for example, LSD, is an effective means of attaining spiritual enlightenment. I mean, we do hear these stories of the past masters getting drunk or using alcohol, and using that as a way of gaining spiritual attainment. But again, these individuals are special individuals. They are individuals who have a high level of realization. The reason given for avoiding intoxicants is that you lose your mindfulness. So one could come to the logical conclusion that as long as I use these intoxicants and I don't lose my mindfulness, then it should be okay to use them as a form of practice. And there's a problem here, because our body can only take so much punishment. And not only that, then we're very prone to addiction. And so somebody using alcohol as a means of gaining spiritual enlightenment is under the risk of destroying their liver and also becoming an alcoholic. And once you become an alcoholic, then you no longer have any way to practice a spiritual path. Because as you know, people who are alcoholics then are mainly concerned with getting drunk. Everything else in their life gets pushed aside for their addiction. They no longer care how that affects their family and their friends and their lovers, whether they go to work or what happens to their physical health. It's the same when it comes to smoking cigarettes, for example. We are well aware of how much damage that does to our health, but we're willing to sacrifice our health for our addictions. So it just goes to show that once we develop these strong addictions, then that becomes the principal concern in our life. And if that is our principal concern, then the spiritual path will no longer be our principal concern. And not only that, then these intoxicants affect us mentally. So whereas there may be some significant experience that could benefit someone on the spiritual path from taking LSD or magic mushrooms, the case is, if you continue to take these things day after day, then you will become mentally unstable, and many people actually lose their minds. And I have to say, from my experience of being a musician when I was younger, that I've met many people who were destroyed by their drug addiction. And on the basis of this drug addiction, then also many people took their own lives. And so you can see that this is not something that's going to lead to any positive results if you don't have an extremely high level of practice. And this is often where we go wrong in the West. We tend to jump to the conclusion that we've gained some significant spiritual practice when we remain ordinary sentient beings. And I think this is because this spiritual path that involves meditation is not an endemic part of our culture. It's not something that we've been doing for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so when a Westerner sits down to meditate for the first time, they feel like there's some kind of significant experience that they achieve. And they see this to be something really special. But for people in the East who have been exposed to these stories of the spiritual masters of the past, then they're not likely to give rise to this kind of misplaced pride, because they see themselves to be, as they are, quite ordinary people, and that these spiritual masters of the past, for example Milarepa and Gotsangpa, as being some significant or special beings. So I think it would be quite clear to you now what is meant by a mistaken or perverse view, and also how that can be an obstacle on your spiritual path. If we take something that is non-virtue to be virtue, and in that way we engage in it, then that's going to cause future consequences that will only lead to us experiencing obstacles on our spiritual path in future times. And likewise, if we disregard virtue and see it to be non-virtue, and then, by not creating the virtuous causes for experiencing well-being in future times, we will not only have obstacles to our spiritual path, but we will experience obstacles in our mundane lives as well. For example, if we see generosity to be a negative thing and we avoid it, and so by that we practice miserliness, then in future times we will not have the necessary resources to engage in the spiritual path, but also to get by in our mundane lives. And so there's not much more to be said on this topic about perverse views or mistaken views. And in the next video, then we're going to cover the view of the two extremes, which is a slightly more difficult topic. So until next time, then see you later.